Hello, welcome to the Hogg with Henley webinar for this week. We're going to be talking about work, but with the new changing world of work, but with particular emphasis on the creative industry, something that many of us in this field, obviously journalism is part of it, movies, other areas, lots of people who are working freelance, lots of people who might want to become freelance into the future in applying their creative skills will no doubt be very, very interested in. We do have, as usual, John Foster-Pedley from Henley, the Dean of the Business School here in South Africa. He'll be joining us. And today's special guest is Preetesh Sewraj, who is with the Loeries. We'll introduce him in just a moment, but let's just make sure that everybody can hear what's going on and see the presentation. Our trusty managing editor of Biznews, Stuart Lohman, is in charge of all those controls. Stu?
Thanks, Alec. Always good to be here. There's on your control panel on the right-hand side, if you can see Preetesh and Alec on your screen with the presentation and hear my voice, can you just give us a high five? There's a little high five button there. That'll let us know that you can, because obviously you can't talk through the webinar. You need to communicate via the written. Okay, cool. Got some high fives, Alec. That's perfect. We do like to keep the conversations flowing. There's little questions drop-down bar on the control panel on the right-hand side. If you can put them in there, Alec or myself will pass them through on to Preetesh or John or Alec himself. But Alec, I think we're good to go. Let's rock and roll.
Excellent. Well, as you can see, I have, you wrote in the weekend, was it 2 weeks ago, about the haircuts, Stu. I think I need one as well, although my hair is thinning out, so it makes it into not too bad an issue. But Preetesh, from your perspective, you're not worrying about haircuts. I can see you got the right hairstyle for lockdown.
I've got it. And good afternoon. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, so everyone's stressing about haircuts, and I just wake up and go into shower and shave my hair, and I'm good to go. Happy.
And how? And how? We've all heard about the Loeries here in South Africa. That it's awards for advertising, and certainly people in the advertising industry, creative industry, it's kind of the pinnacle of their careers. But I never realized it was such a big organization. You're the CEO there. Just tell us a little about it and maybe a bit about yourself before you set the scene for today's discussion.
Yeah, so I joined the Loeries at the beginning of April. So I'm a lockdown CEO because I joined during this time. But luckily, I've been spending time for the last few weeks trying to understand this organization. And it is a mammoth organization. Andrew Human who's the CEO that's left, ran it for 15 years. And it's grown to this absolute behemoth. It's across Africa and the Middle East. And what's really important is across this region, the Loeries is the only major festival whose rankings going to the Global Walk Report. And that actually helps identify some of the best talent that's in our industry, some of the best people that's out there. And so therefore, the Loeries has been doing a lot of good work. Things that people don't know about us is that we're a non-profit organization. And our sole existence is purely just to support the brand communication industry and ensure that this discipline is strengthened and moves forward and shows great creativity in our region.
And reward great work, no doubt. Okay, I'm going to switch off my video screen. I think it's probably good that you switch it off as well. People now know that we're not cardboard cutouts, and that really was the intention. And then will you take us through your presentation?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things is just to give you a little bit of a background in Loeries, but it's not just the Loeries, it's about the creative environment that we're in right now and some of the challenges that we're experiencing. I am not sure whether I can change the slide or if Stuart's going to help me move to the next one.
I'm afraid not. I'm your slide projector today. So let's do that. If you need something more, you let me know.
Sure. So let's go to the next slide. And I think one of the key things that people are concerned about is the awards environment right now. And one of the awards that gets a lot of attention is the Cannes Lions. And then you've got things like the Dubai Links, the Clios. There's a lot of awards in the advertising space at different scales and different levels. But the one thing that we're experiencing right now is because of the challenges of COVID-19, they've all been canceled. And this is being done for a number of reasons. One, because their revenue source is from the awards. If you don't make revenue, you can't hold it. There's uncertainty in the locations where the awards are being held. If there's this uncertainty, you can't plan an event that you're spending millions of dollars on and then knowing that this event is not going to happen. So this is what we're experiencing. If we move on to the next slide, what the reality of where we are. Stuart, isn't it? There we go. So the reality of where we are right now is this is where we are and what we're experiencing. This is how I feel sometimes is, I have a lot of respect for firefighters because it's such a challenging profession. What you do is you have this massive natural disaster ahead of you in the form of fire. But as a firefighter, what do? You go, I have no idea whether I'm going to succeed or fail. But what I do is I get the right equipment and I go in and we tackle it head on. And sometimes I think in a lot of different fields right now, this is a good analogy for the way we should be thinking, is that despite the immense challenge that we have ahead of us, sometimes you've got to think about where you're going to go forward. If we can move to the next slide, please, Stuart. And this is why, for the Loeries, one of the things we've been planning, and when I signed that job offer and I was joining the Loeries, we had this amazing vision of holding a fantastic Creative Week 2020, which was going to be held at Constitution Hill. So the Loeries has been in Durban for quite a few years, and we are moving it up to Johannesburg just to make it more accessible. There's a vibrancy in the city of Johannesburg that's really, really amazing. And if we can go to the next slide as well. So that was the thinking that we had in terms of moving. So we looked at all of these plans and went, where do we sit right now? And where's the Loeries have two plans. Either we go option one, we follow global trends and we postpone until 2021. Or option two, we consider an innovative approach for the Loeries Creative Week. And we looked at it and we realized that a lot of the festivals that were being postponed were happening in the Northern Hemisphere. They're going to be in winter, in October, in November, in that kind of period. So one of the things that we've decided, and we can go into the next slide just as a good holding slide as well. One of the things that we've decided is that we want to ensure that we are ready to tackle this conversation. What happens post-COVID-19? How do we go beyond COVID? And how do we ensure that we stimulate society again and get to a level where we're succeeding as South Africa, as Africa, as the Africa Middle East region? And one of the things that we're doing is we're deciding that we want to go ahead and we're going to hold this Loeries Creative Week, but we're going to make it an event to really understand how we deal with pandemics and how we deal with massive challenges. The number one thing that I've been hearing from everyone is that there wasn't a playbook on how to deal with this COVID-19 outbreak. There wasn't a playbook to deal with how businesses were able to cope with this. And we're all kind of finding our feet and trying to figure this out. And what we want to do as the Loeries, as being the first major event coming out of this, is to be able to bring some of these great thought leaders from brands, agencies, governments, economists, healthcare, thought leaders from across the board and say, come and share your experience in terms of how we're going to exceed and how we're going to succeed and move forward. And if we're faced with challenges like this, and even as we deal with the tail end of this COVID-19 outbreak, how do we ensure that we can find success as a society and move forward and persevere? So we are going to be that platform for that inspiration and show how we're actually going to cope as a species, as the human species, and move past this as well. So that's in a nutshell what we're doing as Loeries. And you can go to the final slide, which is just a holding slide if anyone wants our details and wants to get into contact with us. So every major festival, even non-profit organizations like the Loeries, we pay the bills by charging a fee for entries to come in. And something that's just been announced now at midday is that what we're going to do to support the industry, to support South Africa's society to have access to the best in brand communication and the best knowledge that's out there, we're making all entries for the Loeries free this year. So instead of canceling, instead of saying we're not going to do this, instead of putting other things ahead of getting this message out there, we're going, our number one priority is to support the industry, and we're going to support it by ensuring entries are free, and people can go to loeries.com to find out more about that. And that's essentially my 10 minutes in terms of Loeries and what we're doing.
No, that's brilliant. And that's really the kind of background that we were looking for, just to share a couple of other things of the way other businesses are dealing with it. I had well, before we get on to that, I had a conversation this morning with a medical practitioner who deals with people who have organ transplants. And anyway, the podcast will be on our Inside COVID tonight. But he was saying nobody in the world was prepared for the pandemic. So when you say that businesses weren't actually teed up for it, I think the only person that I've seen who predicted this very publicly was Bill Gates in 2015. You can go and see that TED talk. But getting back to the way other businesses and other businesses dealing with this, I got to chat last night with Gerry Fourie, the chief executive of Capitec. Also, that podcast is on Biznews. But what I found interesting there, we all like Capitec. We think it's one of these organizations that is forward-looking. They have disrupted the banking industry. And what are they doing with COVID-19? And they've got 843 branches, okay, 14,000 staff. And in the lockdown, people aren't going into the branches anymore, clearly, or certainly not as much, anywhere near as much as they did do. And he said what they've done is they have kept 400 of the branches open, and they've turned the other 400 into call centers, because people are going to still want to do banking of some sort, but now they can actually phone their branch, and with the Capitec app, they promoting these branches as part of the call center, and the call centers would then, people would also be working from home. He was saying something like thousands of people who said previously they couldn't work from home. Now that whole group, only 37, have been unable to. Everybody else, they've managed to tee them up and get them to work. But the really interesting thing about this, and it'll be John Foster-Pedley will be coming in a moment, and I'd love him to give us his thoughts on this, is Gerry said, of those 400 branches, they're now most likely not going to keep them open into the future. So they'll be turning them into call centers because people still want to bank. But the consequence of that means that they are no longer going to be paying rent on those 400 stores, as they call them. And the knock-on effect of this for property owners, for just think of one company like Capitec, and there'd be many other companies the same. We've got dark kitchens for restaurants. Why shouldn't we have dark retail operators, where instead of going to the Woolies up here at the Bryanston Centre, in future we might just be phoning them? John, things really are going to be different, aren't they?
I think they are, and regrettably I had connection problems. I didn't hear most of the presentation, so I won't be able to answer anything about that. But we're faced with a really big difference. Some industries are going to thrive, funnily enough, and obviously anything that's online is going up. And then some industries that are mostly face-to-face are really going to struggle enormously. The biggest challenge now is how do we, exactly as you said, Alec, how do we transition into virtual and online, especially when we believed we couldn't? And it turns out that we can. And I think it's a fascinating time for us in this transition as we discover that there are capabilities online that are really very interesting to work with and very promising.
Stu, maybe you can just take us through again how people would submit questions. I see a few hundred people on the webinar today, so I'm presuming there are going to be a lot of questions. Could you just take us through that process?
Excellent, thanks, Alec. Yes, just on the control panel on the right-hand side, there's a little questions drop-down bar. Please just scribe them in there, and then we'll sort of throw them at the guests as they come through. Alec, I see there's not a question, but there's a comment from Louis. He says, Dis-Chem sells clippers. You can just go for an army-style cut.
Who's he talking to? Obviously not me, Stuart. No, I will not, Louis. I will not put my camera back on. Thank you. Yeah, we are changing our lives, aren't we? John Stuart was actually writing a couple of weeks ago in his weekend newsletter that the thing that he misses more than anything else is a haircut. Hence the comment.
Yeah, that's a challenge. We've all become hairdressers, haven't we? I think the safest thing is to get one of those trimmers and put it on a number 3 or 4 and just do that. I mean, let the professionals get at it when we're free again.
Preetesh, just throwing something at you here. The creative process often is done in teams. Are
Yes.
you, from the guys who are going to be supporting the Loeries and entering and etc., and from the creative industry where you're from, are creatives perhaps finding this a challenge, the lockdown?
Not from a productivity point of view. I think one of the key things is when it comes to creativity, it's about sharing ideas and sharing thinking and sharing thoughts. And with the tools that we have at our disposal, you tend to find that ideas can still be shared, creativity can still be generated. I came from an innovation background. So prior to joining the Loeries, I was in an organization where we went deep dives into understanding the innovation levels in South Africa and how it was actually created. And you tend to find even at that space, this technology was already being used to connect people on a global level. So somebody would sit here in South Africa and speak to somebody in France and share ideas. So that hasn't changed. So from that perspective, the only difference is now, instead of having your colleagues sitting next to you in the room while you're doing this, your colleagues joining you on this. And the other thing I also want to add, Alec, as well, is interesting, going from your question that you actually asked John in terms of the changing environment. I've been doing a lot of investigation on this for a number of years, and I have some interesting data that I think was Harvard University generated in 1984. And in 1984, they said the biggest trend that's going to happen in 1985, in a year from then, was work from home. And that's in 1985, and we're sitting in 2020 before it's happened. And a lot of the reasons why it hasn't happened hasn't been because the technology hasn't existed or the ability to do so hasn't existed. And it hasn't happened purely because a lot of organizations have not had the trust in their employees to be able to be in a home environment and actually work. And I think what this COVID-19 epidemic is showing us is that, the trust was now forced on organizations. They had no choice to say, no, you cannot work from home. People have to work from home. And I think what's going to be a revelation is that you can work from home and be productive. And therefore, Capitec is right. You probably are not going to need massive retail footprints to be able to achieve the results that you need to achieve.
Yeah, it's interesting. 2 points on that. The first was Larry Page, the co-founder of Google. I remember back in the good old days, well, a few years ago, when we used to have a license with the Financial Times of London, we were able to republish on Biznews the stories that they produced. And we had a story that Larry Page wrote, a think piece that he wrote, where he said that he felt property values in cities would drop to 5%, get this, 5% of their current values, because people are going to move off-site and increasingly going to be moving to areas just where they've got connectivity and far more pleasant. Now, that's been quite slow in happening. The one point that you mentioned there was trust. Maybe another point is inertia. John, why do you think that we are accelerating now into the digital world, but exactly what Preetesh said, 1984, it was already being predicted, and we're now quite a long way from that, and only now through a pandemic are we starting to take this stuff pretty seriously.
I think there's a lot of sort of tech projections that have fallen by the wayside, because when you're immersed in a tech world, that becomes what you are used to, and you can see the upside of this, but it's always a problem between high tech and high touch. There are things that really work better when you together with people. You can brainstorm easier. You've got a sort of flexibility. You can jump from one person to the other. You can read body language. There's a lot of subtleties in that when you're thinking well together and organizing, you can pick up details from. However, the transition has been from often quite clunky tech and imagining we could work with tech in the same way. Like when you're doing a video conference, it's sometimes more free-flowing or less free-flowing than a face-to-face one is. You've actually got to be quite structured in how you manage that and get different techniques. So I think the tech proselytizers have loved the idea of doing tech and seen the upside. But there are other people who really work very well on face-to-face and engage with people face-to-face. And you could say, well, they must learn the new skills. But I think it's only now that tech is really catching up with some of the nuances of what we can do face-to-face. There's better AI, there's better connectivity, there's better cameras, there's better skills, there's just better preparedness among people. So I think it's a more complicated equation than saying, yeah, just tech's going to deliver for us. We also have to ask is what doesn't tech deliver, and how do we replace that?
Yeah, good point. And talking about tech and tech improving, I think, why don't we put our cameras back on now? It's much more interesting, I'm sure, to see faces than, and maybe books in the background. There we go. Okay, there we go. And the tech certainly has improved from last week when we were on at 7 o'clock. Unfortunately, John, Stuart, and I live in Netflix country, it seems, because just as we came on, the bandwidth went for a loop. Talking of which, Stu, have you any questions?
Thanks, Alec. There's just a follow-up on your Capitec discussion from Chris. He says, so if they're going to not reopen branches, there'll be less people that travel to the malls. So it's not just the landlord affected, but the other stores having less foot traffic. And I think it goes back to maybe what Larry Page said on property value.
Such an interesting point. You know, we can, as to John's point a moment ago, we can speculate on what companies are going to do. But when you hear someone like Gerrie Fourie, who has been the preeminent innovator in the banking space for a couple of decades now, his company saying, this is what we're going to do. We've now learned a really good lesson. We can get people working from home. We can service a lot of our customers through call centers rather than physical branches. We're not going to lay anybody off. In fact, we're going to be adding to our staff complement. And if people want to be serviced in a different way, why shouldn't we do it? John, if Capitec starts that, or if Capitec can do that, surely there would be other companies that might follow.
Absolutely right. I mean, I completely agree that nothing like a crisis, with all its seriousness and terribleness, there's nothing like a crisis to force us into new ways of thinking and understanding the possibilities. It's always amusing when somebody says we can't do that, that's impossible. You know, what they're talking about quite often is their own frame of reference rather than any external reality. We, for example, we're one of the industries in education. Face-to-face education requires face-to-face and people gathered, and people are very attached to that sort of quality of experience of working with other people in the classroom. We managed to convert to 100% online in a week. Actually, we've done quite a lot of preparation because, being futurists and strategy people, we've been really looking at COVID, and it was obviously very clear what was going to happen, so we were able to prepare. But now we're very successfully doing all our education online. We've learned tech, we've learned methods, we've had a fascinating time understanding how to communicate and engage with people and share learning online, and it's been unbelievably effective. So for us, this isn't, we won't go back to the 100% online ever. We'll go back into a new, fascinating world of communicating and educating online as well as face-to-face. But it also opens up the possibility of democratizing education, sharing it with everybody, and then finding platforms and methods that we can get to that mass of the population who've never had access to education. And it's clear that we can do it now, and it's only in our heads, in our concepts, and our habits of mind that tell us we can't. We absolutely can. This is a chance to re-educate South Africa with interesting collaborations with people. And I'd love to work with Preetesh on this. It would be fascinating to see how we could get to most people and educate them. So it's great opportunities.
Yeah. Preetesh, the Loeries it's an event though, isn't it? It's a gala evening. It's the who's who of the creative industry comes together. With social distancing, one would presume that they might be able to come together, but they have to perhaps sit at different tables. How have you been thinking this one through?
Yeah, so I think, you know, it's when people think of the Loeries, again, they always think about us when we were 15, 20 years ago. And sure, it culminates in an event, but the reality is that throughout the entire year, we're working towards delivering on our goal, which is supporting brand communications and supporting South African and society across Africa and the Middle East to have access to that. So the event is just one part of it, and it's not the entire work that we do, but it is important. And what we've been doing is we've been actually running a lot of projections and trying to understand where we will be. So our event is now planned for around November. We had a September event, but based on everything that's happening, we're now moving towards November. And that's purely based on the fact that, again, as John alluded to earlier, there's a lot that you can do on a virtual environment, but there's also a lot of nuance that's lost if you don't have that physical contact. And as long as it's safe and as long as it benefits society, we will ensure we have a physical environment and a physical event in November. But again, as you're right, we're thinking about the safety behind it. And if the safety makes sense, it is going to happen.
John, do you think Preetesh is going to be okay with that November date of bringing people together in one big room?
Well, he looks like he's pretty okay on everything, if you ask me, but you just ask on the event, yeah. Look, we watch these events on TV, and I have to say the audience interaction is part of what you watch, so it's really difficult to do. But you can do really fascinating things with choreographing the event, cutting in, cutting out. We've been watching Trevor Noah and you know, the other people on TV working from their homes. It's quite riveting. And the fact is that the whole thing about visual arts and film arts is that they're not rational, they are emotive and they're moving. We watch films and operations and they move us. So there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't create an amazing Loeries event using all those skills of advertising and production. That would be some of the best stuff we'd ever see on TV or online. So I think give it a go. It's quite an adventure, and see where that takes us. Go for it.
Are you thinking along those lines?
We are planning every possible scenario you can think of. So the reality is we're I was chatting to someone and they said you can't even predict what's going to happen next Monday, let alone try and predict what's going to happen at the end of the year. So the only thing that we can do to be prepared is to make sure that we have a plan that has every single possible permutation in it. So that's what we've done. We've budgeted it out. We've looked at every option that's out there. And the option that we're speaking about right now, and the physical event, the reason we speak about that is because it's probably the most inspirational event. It's the one that people are looking forward to. Everyone's been in their home already for over 2 weeks now. People are looking forward to the thought of being able to meet their colleagues, to meet influencers from around the world who may be able to come to an event. And I think we would be failing if we didn't offer that option as the first prize and work towards that option. But assuming we can't deliver that, we will ensure that it's an inspirational event in whatever form it may be.
Lots of creativity. Stu?
Thanks, Preetesh. And there's just a question here around creative thinking, and why do you think we need it for every business?
Yeah, I think so. So let me tell you, as I said, I came from an innovation background, and I analyzed innovation day in, day out for over 12 years in every degree possible. And when I looked at it and went, where did innovation come from? Innovation came from somebody having an idea. And where did the idea come from? The idea came from creative thinking. I think that's why businesses need to have creative thinking. If you have the ability to analyze your environment and analyze the problems, and even if the problems don't exist, to have that forward thinking, to think about how can you create solutions that's going to benefit society, that results from creative thinking into an idea. That idea results in tangible innovation of some sort, and that innovation is actually what results in movement within an economy and boosts an economy forward. So I think creative thinking really is at that early step, at the start of where we actually start from to actually move economies forward. And if you're not applying creative thinking within your organizations or even in your personal life in terms of how you can move forward, you're actually doing a disservice to yourself or your organization.
John?
Well, I think one of the things about when we talk about creativity that's so interesting is those suitcase words again. A suitcase has got creativity written on it. You open it and 1,001 animals fly out of different hues and nature, and we all think differently about what creativity is. But for me, for me, creativity is simply bringing imagination to something. And the other thing to think about creativity, if you're being creative, you actually can't plan what the outcome's going to be. You can say you're trying to create this thing, but the point of being creative is you don't know what the outcome is. You're creating it. So from the beginning, you can't visualize that. It's a process of visualizing something new. And so I often think that those very rational people, the extremely analytic, some of the very, very good consultants, the ones who are fantastic with data, must really struggle, rather like classical musicians do. They must struggle to improvise sometimes because they're asked to be very specific. But the reality is all our lives, when we observe what we do, we are being imaginative, creative, moving into new areas all the time. I think we stigmatize that in the way we try and productize, algorithm, make an algorithm of all our businesses to keep things the same and scale them up. That's making it reliable and scaling up and making money. But we often have to go back and find again, was it relevant? Because the relevance slips. And the other thing that's fascinating me is how you get a company like Discovery, that's been one of the most creative we've had, you could argue, set up by 4 actuaries. Would you believe it? So there you are, four actuaries, the most analytical people you can think of, could come up with one of the most creative companies. And I love that paradox.
But they're not normal actuaries, I would venture to say. Adrian Gore is hardly the epitome of the kind of, although mind you, what is a normal actuary? I've met some very interesting.
Exactly, he's an actuary. That's the frame of mind we have. An extrovert actuary looks at your shoelaces instead of his own. It's total rubbish. So what we have are people who've got deep analytics, and when they can hold that rigor of mind, but when they get into imagination, that combination of the deep analytics and the imagination is somehow more powerful because it's held somehow while the energy is spinning around, the creative energy. So I think we have to think of our creative worlds as being both rational and imaginative, and it's a combination of those two properly brought together that creates results.
I was surprised when you mentioned the lack of creativity with classical musicians. Did I hear you correctly?
No, this comes from some of my MBA students. I remember one really wonderful, Janine, wonderful violinist for the Cape Town Orchestra, and she was saying, I can't improvise, and I can never improvise because I've been taught to do this. Whereas my jazz musician friends, who are both articulate in written notes, whatever, they can improvise, whatever. Whereas my rock and blues musician friends can't read music, but they're fantastic at improvising. So it's like they're all brilliant musicians, but they're working in different domains. But some of the classical musicians, I find that they really struggle with improvisation because they create beautiful music guided by the conductor. Whereas the heavy rock guys would never want a conductor around there at all. Man, that's just stopping me thinking. Fascinating.
I see, Preetesh has got is that a ukulele that you've got in the background there?
Oh yeah, well, I forget what it's called. It's actually a musical instrument from Greece. So I like all of these weird musical instruments and stuff like that. So part of my stuff is to make sure I'm surrounded by lots of interesting creative things. So I studied archaeology, and I've never practiced as an archaeology a day in my life, purely because I like the creativity again of being able to apply my mind to human civilization and where it's come from. And I still am fascinated by us as a species and everything we've done. And then you take that, and I've used it only in the business world. And just going through what John has said, I think, yeah, one of the key things in terms of creativity and that imagination is to just indulge yourself in it. Sometimes you just have to give yourself permission to say, let me dream about what's possible, and it doesn't matter what the end result is. And I think when a business world, you're told to have an end result, and a lot of us think in that way as well. But outside of that, if you've got something that stimulates you and that adds value to you as a person in terms of creativity, do it.
Stuart, you must just jump in, but I'd really like to ask the guys to give us their thoughts on this point. So you are a left brain thinker. You are an accountant. You are looking at the shoelaces when you're making your conversation, probably from your gray shoe base. You are successful in what you've done in the left brain, and now the world has changed, and the world has changed dramatically. How do you break out of that and become creative? How do you engage your right brain? Do you start listening to Led Zeppelin, or is there maybe a musical instrument that you need to learn? Where do you even start when you have been so pushed into that frame of thinking. Do you want to give it a crack there, John?
Well, I'd like to start by saying that the left brain, right brain idea is a left brain idea. and actually it doesn't work like that at all. Our minds are incredibly sophisticated and plastic and interwoven. They're extraordinary systems. So I mean, obviously there's an element of some reality in it, but neuroscience has kind of debunked that. But I think that's a very interesting point. It's a very good question. I think this churning of our mind, this rational mind, is always seeking answers, always seeking to land. It's fascinating. If you take somebody like Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote Homo Deus Sapiens and those 21 lessons, he's a historian, rather like Preetesh is an archaeologist. Is that right?
Archaeology, yeah.
Yeah. And wonderful. And they live in narratives and stories. In some ways, and what he would argue is that the narrative allows the brain to brings people together emotionally. That's one way. Narrative, stories, figurative devices, vision, really good art, nice music are always ways to take you out of that rational thing. The other thing he does a lot of is meditating, and I'm not saying that we all have to meditate, although I do believe it's very good for one if you do it properly. What that does is you're not thinking about your mind, you're actually focusing on something that stops that mind that's rambling on, obscuring what's really going on and what's around there. It defilters you. And I think there's a lot about being creative is about defiltering, and we become so, I think, trained into thinking we need to be professional, responsible, that we can't be amateur anymore. And amateur is, if the thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly to begin with, isn't it? Were you great at golf when you started, or drums, or whatever it is? No, you had to start doing badly. And amateur comes from love, it's amateur, passion. So we have to recover that thing. So move where your passion is, allow it to. Don't let this critique in one's mind, which is just elder brothers, elder sisters, parents, peers, teachers saying bad things to you. Don't let that dominate. Let yourself flow into those areas. And what that does is allow you to be far, far more capable and allow you to go into new areas. So I don't think there's some algorithmic way of becoming creativity, although people do have those systems. I think it's about consciousness and trust in yourself and in your humanity above all.
Alec, just to add as well, I think if anyone's listening to this and they're trying to figure out how to change their frame of reference, and to bring some creativity in it. Simple thing. Tomorrow maybe you don't want to start it today, but tomorrow when you wake up, and if you're used to brushing with your right hand, brush with your left hand. Challenge yourself to do something totally different. It's that small. If you start the day by brushing with your left hand and you've been used to years doing with your right hand, you'll set the tone for the rest of the day to just change and experiment and try something new. And creativity will come from that. Small things.
I've got to share this with you because my journey on creativity started when I was working for a very brief period in corporate at the bank. And I saw this course. It was a flyer that said thinking skills. So off I went to thinking skills course. And a very smart guy, you'd relate to him well. He's a pilot, a guy called Richard Broom, John, a pilot like you. He then explained to us, he started with, okay, you say it's not left and right brain, but I can assure you at that point in time in my life, I was incredibly analytic and didn't really have much interest in anything that was outside of numbers and writing about them and so on. And the journey was to then start with mind mapping, and with Tony Bazan, who I mentioned to you, I had the privilege of meeting in Davos by being the only person who went to his press conference. He was that unpopular back in the early 90s. And of course, today, the late Tony Bazan is hugely followed. And then after mind mapping came juggling to try and engage both hemispheres. And after juggling came meditation. So it was a journey which I've been on from a creative space. And I think you got to start somewhere. And for me, that was where I started, was to start learning about stuff I didn't know before. And perhaps if there are those who are caught up in the same environment that I was affected by in the early 90s, maybe they can also learn from that and just break out, use the brushing on the left-hand side tomorrow. But juggling is also a fantastic thing. And, you know, when you see these guys at the robots, I often say to Jeanette, my wife, these guys have got to be sharp, because when you juggle, it's practicing the coordination of the brain, or certainly that's what we were taught. And by doing that, it relaxes you, but it also improves your neural pathways. Now, you imagine these guys, they spend the whole day, and I don't know if you've seen better jugglers in the circus, but I
They're amazing.
certainly haven't. And it's almost like, why can't we take some of these chaps, and when you talk to them, I always try and help where I can, for these guys, and you talk to them, incredibly articulate. I guess they must be earning reasonable money doing juggling now, but that's something else that one can explore and look, and you can do it at home, and it doesn't cost you anything. Stu, do we have any questions?
Yes, thanks, Alec. No, interesting discussion there. Chris wants to know the future of work. He says, what do we tell high school pupils is the future of work, and how should they prepare for the future?
Okay, well, Preetesh, you go first.
You know, it's an interesting one, and I always think the one thing that high school pupils need to know is that the environment's constantly changing. The one thing that you've got to do is, if you want to succeed in any environment, regardless of where life takes us, is to have the ability to adapt and be adaptable. I can't predict it. I really don't know where things are going. There's a lot of smart people around the world that's working, and it's a combined effort of so many different smart people that are really directing our society forward into lots of different directions. And if you're going to cope with all of the stimulus that's being sent to us, you should learn the ability to basically be able to go out there and change and be a chameleon of sorts, because the environment's always going to change. And if you don't have the ability to adapt an environment, you're not going to succeed. And I think that's why we as human beings, as I said, from an archaeological perspective, I look at us. The reason that all of us are sitting here today is purely because throughout our history, we've had ancestors who have changed and adapted to environments, and that's evolution and how we've ended up at this point. I mean, if there wasn't this ability to adapt and change to the changing environment, none of us would be here. So that's the one thing that you can contribute to the work environment going forward.
John, I'll give you my 5 cents. If you look over the top of my head here, there's it's a collage of one of my visits to the Berkshire Hathaway AGM, where I did meet, you can't see them too far away, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. And Warren Buffett has a lovely story that I often repeat when he gets students, young people who come to visit him in Omaha, and he'll spend the morning with them answering their questions, then take them out for lunch to Gorat's, which is a kind of a low-grade steakhouse, but it serves huge T-bone steaks and hash browns, and of course double thick chocolate sundaes, which I think is his favorite. But he says they often ask him this question: what should I do, Mr. Buffett? What is the future of work? And his reaction to them is, if you think carefully, of everybody who's in your class here, who, if you could earn 10% of what they generate in their life for the rest of their life, which of them would you invest in? Who would you invest in of your classmates? And without fail, he says, the response is not the smartest, it's not the best looking, it's not the best from the best family. It's always the one that is reliable. It is always the person that, you know, if they say they're going to be there, they'll be there. And he says that too is the thing that he tries to teach the young people. So to that question, the only constant that we know happens in our society is change. But if you can be the reliable one, if you can be the calm one, if you can be the rock, if you can be the person that always your colleagues, your associates, your other business partners know that if you say you'll do something, it's done. You don't know how great an asset it is, and that comes from the Grootbaas himself from Omaha. So that would be my little contribution there. John, your thoughts?
I think that's a brilliant story, actually. I mean, and I was reflecting on some of my schoolmates. one in particular who's got multiple houses and yachts. Nobody would have believed it, but he was the guy everyone went to, you know, the captain of the rugby team, but not bright in any way, apparently. In fact, he was a good friend of a drummer we talked about once, Bill Bruford, who played for Genesis and Yes for a long time. And I remember Bill saying, I never thought Chris would do so well at school, but he really has. And it's exactly that. I think, you know, to be reliable is not to be static. And I think that's the point. You know, as life changes, how can you stay reliable in that change? So you've got to learn and move with it. You know, being reliable isn't being stodgy. It's you know, somehow you just make things happen and people can depend on you. So that idea of being trustworthy, those deep character, the character building things, I have to say, are enormously important. Most of our minds are pretty smart. You know, everyone listening here, they're smart people. They're very smart. Often they don't believe or see how smart they are. And I have great pleasure in giving scholarships to the MBA to people who don't think they can do it, like John Flismus, the comedian, and Barry Van Sale, who is Johnny Clegg's drummer, and Khan from the Parlotones, and people like that, who've made great contributions in the creative world, but just turn out to be really, really clever, really good people. And when they enter this domain, they just can do it. I also think that reliability issue comes to people in different times of their lives. And some people have very fragmented youth, you know, like George Bush said, when I was young and foolish, I was young and foolish. You know, maybe, and the neuroplasticity arguments say that we don't stop evolving till we're 28 anyway in our brains. So sometimes people come to things a bit later. So don't panic if you go to university and you didn't do well, or you don't go to university and you think, I've missed my chance, so I'm not this. You are smart, you are creative, and you can do lifelong learning. So I think learning to learn is really, really important as a life skill.
I love that the point you made about trustworthiness in this world that we're in now, where it was described to me by a medical guy as an infodemic, he called it, that there's just so much garbage. John, if you could see my inbox and the number of members of the Biznews community who send me stuff that they honestly believe is right, but it is very quick Google or patently fake news. That's the infodemic that we're living in. If you can be the one that people trust, if they know that they can come to you for reliable information, then that must also be a great asset in the world of flux that we're in.
I think that's true. There's so much stuff spiraling around our heads, and the conspiracy theories, the rumor mills of fake news factories are so sophisticated and brilliant, and dive into our emotional being. You know, the thing about being rational is you start to think that there's something wrong with being emotional, and it's absolutely not. Our emotions are a critical part of our lives and of the way we think and create and actually work. That it ties into those things, and our desperate minds are trying to make sense of things and latch on to stories that have some sort of coherence. And you've really got to learn those skills of detaching and reviewing. And again, that's another thing that meditation and those things do, whether it's running, whatever. You see the process of this churning craziness that goes on in most of our heads, and you learn to detach from it and just watch it and be even amused by it, and integrate it into what you're being without thinking it is you. And I think that's a really, really important skill, and that allows you to be creative as well, because you don't take your own thinking on your own concepts and precepts too seriously. You allow them to change, and change they must as circumstances change. Yeah.
Preetesh, that's pretty much your world as well, isn't it? Brands are all about trust.
They are, because you have to think about brands. Brands are, in the same way that I know who Alec is or who John is, in the same way when you buy into a brand, it has a personality. It almost takes on a humanistic kind of form in the mind of someone. So if that brand offers you a certain level of trust, you buy it because you know what you're getting out of it. But if that brand then goes and betrays that trust in some way, in the same way that if a human being betrays your trust, it takes a time before you trust them again. It happens with brands as well. So that's one of the key things that we've always been evaluating and having a look at it. How do you maintain your brand image, your brand equity over time? How do you maintain that trust? And just like human beings, sometimes brands will fail and have issues because the people behind them. And you also have to think about, as an organization, how do you restore trust in that brand in situations like that? And I've seen that happen a number of times with a number of different brands. And some get it right, and some understand how to build that trust again and develop a relationship with the consumer. But sadly, you see a lot of brands who are failing in that space. What interests me is, in this phase that we're in right now, are we going to see brands really understanding how to come out of this COVID-19 lockdown, this phase, with a consumer who's a lot less trusting than they used to be? You know, I think we as consumers, we're a lot more cynical in terms of, I trust the brand, but if I go into a store and I buy it, do I know that no one has touched it and had an issue from a secondary point? So these are some of the things that brands need to deal with right now, where they are not fully in control of the experience that the brand and the consumer are going through right now.
Thanks, Preetesh. There's a nice comment here from Serona, Alec. She says, it's so refreshing to hear all of this. She's listening in from Germany, and often brands are caught up in profits and creativity that isn't monetized and often sidelines. So just to bring it out, that's a nice comment there. Just on reliability and trustworthiness, Keith says it's not just all about high EQ.
High EQ. Well, certainly EQ has to be more relevant in the world that we're going into, gents.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, you know, I think what we love to do is we love to put it down to jargon in terms of this emotional quotient and all that. But the reality is, in the end of the day, what it has to be is, how in touch are you with the environment and everyone around you? And again, as I say, in the environment we're in right now, is one of the things we're struggling with is that we don't have as much stimulus as you would normally have from a face-to-face conversation. As we go into this, we're going to learn to adapt how to take the various little bits of stimulus we get from, whether it's a webinar like this or a Zoom call, and then be able to translate that into a real world environment when you're meeting people as well. So it's all about being able to take nuggets of information and being able to cope and assimilate that knowledge in a way that actually results in some benefit for you.
Yeah, I think the idea of EQ is fascinating. I mean, again, it's an intellectual construct around emotion. So how do you get EQ? You know, and it's people, you want to virtue signal them by saying I have EQ, and you demonstrate empathy. But it's, I suppose it's simple. I mean, can you feel for other people? Can you project yourself? If somebody disagrees with you violently, what they're saying makes sense to them. Can you understand how in their frame of reference that makes sense and how they might feel that way? You don't have to feel the same thing. You've obviously got to have some resonance. We have things called mirror neurons, apparently, that allow us to pick up how other people feel. And if you allow your mirror neurons to work, you will get a sense of how people are. Can you feel for other people without being sucked into it, without losing your center? And can you help? Can you feel how they're feeling? And can you also resonate with them? Practicing that is really important. So there are techniques to allow you to do that. But at the end of the day, we talk about empathy. There's a little e empathy and a big E empathy. The little e empathy is when somebody comes in front of you with a big problem and is talking about that you know, that they've got a big problem at work or at home, and you want to do everything for them. But if you're running an organization, you've got 100, 200 people, all of whom you need empathy for as well. So you can't give a solution to that one person in front of you and lose empathy for the people that you can't see, that are supported by everyone's endeavors. So the real EQ for me is having that big E empathy, is understanding the system, the nature, the nation, the people, the communities that you have around you without falling in for that. Understanding your job is to understand how they feel, how to improve everybody's lot, and have a systemic empathy for the world around you. That is deep EQ for me.
And perhaps coming out of this, South Africans will be even more trained in EQ because we can see around us how others are suffering perhaps more than we might be.
Yeah, I mean, how hard is that? You know, when by definition we're sitting here with internet and screens and ideas, we're in an extremely comfortable position in most ways compared with most people around us. The big challenge to me is to understand that none of our kids can thrive unless all of our kids thrive. So we cannot live in a world with a high Gini coefficient. That is anti-creative, it's anti-everything, it's anti-honest, it's anti-human. And so you have wrapped up in those people who are not having opportunity, intellect, creativity, and the possibility to create a decent nation that's going to work. And when you've got a very high Gini coefficient like South Africa, it's a terrible thing to live with. And we have to change it, not because even of the moral issues, which are huge, but simply just on a practical level. You can't build a thriving nation with those dynamics. So you have to believe in the people. One of the dynamics of separation of us and them is us always feels better than them. And in the COVID days, we're realizing, there's no science of race, there's no difference between people. COVID latches onto everybody. That's going to bring it home to us that we are all the same. We're one humanity, one set of people, and we need to work together to make it happen. And we have to see that having people in poverty is a terrible thing to live with, and we have to change that, because by giving them the capabilities and allowing them to be more creative and use their minds and educate and develop their thinking and give the opportunity, we're going to create many more operations, many more businesses, many more things that are going to work, better services, and we're going to have a better life for our kids and their kids. And that's simple thinking. There's nothing complicated or hyper intellectual about that. It's just, that's the sort of empathy we need. It's not a bleeding heart one. It's just, wow, we can't live like this. All our kids need to have a decent future.
I think we agree. Oh, sorry, do we still have time, or we? So just to add something quickly, one of the sad things, we've been looking at the psychological level and the way human behavior is after tragedy. And one of the things we have to be prepared for, and we have to face this head on, is that generally normal human behavior is that you go through the tragedy, and within that phase, you have the thinking that I'm going to do something good for the world after this, and I'm going to support the world. And immediately as the tragedy passes, you're going to find that you're impacted by that tragedy. And then that little bit of selfishness comes and goes, hey, I need to take care of myself first before I can take care of anyone else. And then you're trying to divert resources to taking care of yourself and your family in that situation, and that snowballs to a point where we go back to more or less the same sort of situation that we were in prior to that. It's the reason why you don't find that Gini coefficient improving. It's purely because people go back to a point of, let me take care of myself and my family first. So we need that awareness right now. We need that awareness that we're going to go through this, and once this is over, we're going to likely be at some sort of mind frame that goes, hey, I need to make sure I'm sorted out first. But there's never going to be a situation where you're properly taken care of. The only way we're going to move forward is to come out of this and realize, I'm going to be struggling a little bit. I'm going to see people losing their jobs as well within my organization. I could potentially be that. But don't let that stop me from trying to improve the situation of everyone around me, because the benefit of that is greater for the whole of society and for me in the end of the day.
Nice. Stu, we're nearly out of time. Are there any burning questions?
There's just one. I think you're talking about education, John, and there's two around it with the younger, the primary schools and the high schools. How do you I think it goes back to how do you replicate your model going online to these levels of education? It goes back to resources, I think. And then John Hogg, your namesake there, Alec, says, in education, maths and science get a lot of emphasis. What about increasing the emphasis on arts and history to the same level, to know what has happened before and how the world adapted, etc.? They shouldn't be mutually exclusive. I think that's high and that's the place to end.
You're not going to do a Nantlhanene on us, are you?
I will answer the second question after John does the first. I've got some points on that.
Okay, I think the education thing is fascinating. I mean, it's absurd to us so that we think education is going to university for 3 or 4 years and that's it for life. I mean, it doesn't fit with our lived experience anymore. How can that be the case? And it's very exclusive, and people can't afford not to work. So we have capabilities now, and one of the ones we're using now is quite easily we can take mass education. Infrastructure needn't be national, it can be global. accreditation of education needn't be national, it can be global. It doesn't even have to be academic. You can have bodies of people, of really leading companies and organizations that you trust, who will put some form of accreditation on the education, not going through the universities. Why does it need to do that? You could have a blockchain accreditation of some sort that would work out. So we can rethink what education means, and it's about giving people the skills. And in terms of the science versus the arts thing, again, it's very true that the hard subjects have been at the top. It's true, you want your doctor to be very well capable. You don't want your doctor to be great at dancing. You want to be good at science and medicine. But it doesn't mean that those two things don't go together. You know, a doctor who's explored the other aspects of their brain, and a doctor who can be imaginative and inventive under difficult circumstances, a brilliant doctor. So you need all those things. So we need to rethink what education means. We need to democratize. We need to bring the cost down. We need to give it to everybody. And we need to do that fast, and we need to do it well. And it's all possible. So let's do it. This is my thing. And let's do it. Let's get those people together, create those things, and JFDI, just do it. You know.
Preetesh?
Yeah, so I agree that we need a lot more balance in society in terms of, and this is the tertiary education. So specifically on tertiary education, we need a lot more balance. Right now, what happens is the brand equity for the creative arts is really low. So if you go to your parent as a student today in matric and you go, what I want to study is I want to study something in the creative space, your parents are going to be, no, once you go for something where you're guaranteed an income. But the data is clear out there. People who study some of the more creative subjects are better leaders within society, and that's within business, within organizations, and move society forward because of the ability to think creatively. So what we have to do, and what I'm really passionate about, is in that education space, having a greater respect for the diversity of education. And because I'm specifically in the creative space, supporting creative education and ensuring that we build up that equity and that knowledge for the importance of people studying creativity right now.
And just to close off with, John, you reminded me of a guy that I met only once. It was at a cocktail party at Anglo American, and there was this little fellow in the middle of the room. Obviously, we all knew what Harry Oppenheimer looked like, but you expect that this icon of society would be, or certainly of society back then, and certainly when you're a young trainee journalist, would be, well, somehow a lot bigger. And I remember engaging with him and then studying some of his ways. He was an extraordinary businessman. Bobby Godsell, Clem Sunter, people like that who you would not imagine would come through a mining house, were some of the most senior people there. But what he used to do, John, was not hire necessarily only mining engineers or people with science degrees. His favorite was what they call PPEs, isn't that right,
Yes.
John? It's what is it? Philosophy,
Politics and economics, yeah.
Politics and economics. So that's outside of the sciences. It's very much the history and the I guess archaeology would fall into that kind of category, because he believed that you needed exactly what we were talking about a little earlier to be a really a well-grounded and balanced leader. You needed perhaps more than just the scientific skills. So an interesting end to our webinar today. Thanks, gents, for your incredible wisdom and for sharing with us. It was fascinating, and I could see from the engagement of the attendees that there was lots of interest from that side as well. Stu, would you like to just close off from your side, please?
Yes, thanks, Alec, and thanks to John and Preetesh. We will post the video as well as a transcript of the webinar on the website as soon as possible for anyone who wants to sort of have another look or another listen. And yeah, that's it from my side. Alec, thanks as well to you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you, Preetesh.